Welcome to the program. Joining me tonight, the Communications Minister, Paul Fletcher, the Shadow Minister, Michelle Rowland, former News Director, Hal Crawford, the eSafety Commissioner, Inman Grant, and international security expert, Lydia Khalil. Please make all of them feel welcome. Teresa Corbyn is from the Communications Consumer Group, ACAN. You're talking about a lot of the people you work with. In fact, your own site has been taken down. Can you just describe what the impact has been for a lot of people with Facebook pages that are not news today?
So thousands of charities, not-for-profits, small businesses, Indigenous communities, groups that push out warnings about fires and floods have all been affected today. And this doesn't just affect the news sites, it affects all of us. So people can't get the information, and Facebook has become a gatekeeper and they have too much control.
The Minister says it's Facebook's fault. Do you agree?
I think Facebook could have given us a lot more warning than they have. They certainly haven't given us any guarantees about bringing the information back, and we really need it. Otherwise, what's going to happen now is that I think this could end up being like Cambridge Analytica being a storm in a teacup. This is going to be worse because so many groups only use Facebook as their website presence. They don't know how to set up their own websites and they don't have the money to do that. So I think that the impact is massive, and Facebook needs to really think about the impact not just on those businesses now, but also on Facebook long term.
Georgia Wild, when you woke up this morning, how did you react?
I was a bit shocked. As like a previous student editor, I was surprised that student publications at universities were kind of roped into this, especially because they have a smaller readership, and also independent, small media organisations targeted at youth. And I think those platforms use Facebook because it's widely used and it's easily to disseminate very digestible content for young people, and it's also easy to facilitate conversation and comments. And so I was just kind of taken aback that that opportunity was taken away from those platforms which really rely on it.
So what's your question for the panel?
My question is, how will small publications with little budget, who often represent marginalised voices, be able to survive these restrictions, and what will the government do to ensure that they will be as protected as major media corporations?
All right, I'm going to put that to Hal Crawford first.
Yeah, let me have a go at that one. Because, Georgia, I think you've nailed it. I think that Facebook, the move by Facebook is going to devastate a lot of small publishers, and disproportionately the small guys and the young guys and the online guys. And the big guys are going to be okay, but some of these people, as you would know, get up to 80–90% of their traffic straight from Facebook. So they're gone overnight. And I know from talking to people in the industry that this is going to cost jobs, quite a lot of jobs.
Where will those jobs be?
Well, if you get 90% of your traffic and you're a news producer and you get revenue from that traffic and it goes overnight, that's a big problem. Now, pretty much the only good thing that I think is in the code that Paul obviously champions, and just about everyone else does too, but about the only good thing is the advance warning of algorithm change. So, sorry, I don't want to get too into the detail, but I don't think that the code is a good thing. Facebook did sort of telegraph ahead of time that they were going to do this. Rod Sims, the ACCC chief, said it was brinkmanship, and I think that they proved that they were willing to, they proved they were willing to go beyond that brink, didn't they?
I would say, as someone who was in the tech industry for 22 years, it was a pretty clumsy misfire. I mean, they let Google take all the body blows and the shrapnel, and then they went with the nuclear option without any warning. They deployed, natural language processing systems that had glitches, and then you ended up with this over-blocking. So it shows how much market power that they have and what steps they're willing to take. You know, this isn't just about Australia to them. This is about precedent and the risk that it poses to them on a global scale if other governments follow suit.
You're someone that, in your role as eSafety Commissioner, has spent years trying to get these platforms to take content, take material off their platforms. They talk continuously about how impossible that is to do. How then can Facebook overnight switch off news and information for a whole country if they can't tackle abuse imagery on their site?
Well, precisely. They can target advertising with deadly precision. They should be able to target child sexual abuse material racism, online hate, all of these things. It's really a matter of priorities and corporate will, which is why we've pushing them so hard around safety by design. Safety is considered a cost center or an afterthought.
And an important point here, Hamish, is that when we set up the eSafety Commission, we legislated to do that in 2014, the companies all said, no, this isn't necessary, it's inappropriate interference with our business. So these kinds of threats are not new. We stuck to our guns, and we now have a world-leading safety regulator, online safety regulator.
Michelle Rowland.
Can I jump in, Hamish, on this?
Sure.
In terms of just in terms of your point about, why the companies haven't been more forceful in terms of getting disinformation off of their sites and other harmful content. I think one of the key reasons is that it goes to their logic and to their profit motive, and that type of content drives user engagement. We've seen that disinformation on those sites drives user engagement. We've seen posts that solicit, primal emotions like fear and hate drive user engagement. So that's a key part of the reason why they haven't had the will to tackle some of the disinformation, hate speech, and all sorts of other things on their platforms until it became too much of a reputational issue for them. I do just want to jump in very quickly about something a bit more fundamental, that a lot of the questions that have been asked so far by the audience gets to the fact that it's the users who are impacted by this. But let's not fool ourselves. The decisions that were made around the commercial code that Facebook made, that government made, that media made, were not based on the user and their needs. They were based on the commercial interests of the tech companies and the commercial interests of major media news organizations, and the user has been completely caught off guard and in the middle.
But if this is a contest between the power of the sovereign state versus the tech giant, hasn't Facebook just thumbed its nose at Australia?
It's thumbed its nose, but I don't think that this is the end of the story yet. The point is that, as Rod Sims outlined, the reason why Facebook is able to act in this way is because it enjoys substantial market power and has just reinforced that. That is the whole reason why regulation needed to be devised in order to ensure that that market power was kept in check.
But
now,
we would hope Paul Fletcher's bluff.
Well, can I just pick up on the point that Michelle made? If you go back 25 years ago, the expectation was that the internet would be lots of small sites, very disaggregated, lots of diversity. But in fact, it's ended up being a small number of very large businesses, and that does raise very serious market power issues, as Michelle rightly says. And these are issues
But it didn't end up that way. I'm sorry to interrupt. It didn't end up that way just out of inevitability. It ended up that way because it was not regulated. We've gotten ourselves into a position where we have let a major commercial company that's driven by profit motive essentially be responsible for a huge part of our information infrastructure. This was not by accident. This is something that was caused by lack of regulation, and it's incumbent upon us as citizens in a democracy and our elected representatives to have done something about this and to let us think creatively now. I mean, I think this is really a key moment for us. I'm sorry to hear about the disruption for everybody, but at the same time, this has energized me to think that we can now come up with some creative solutions, perhaps around a public infrastructure, not
Can I interrupt, Lydia? Because I've got a question for Lydia.
If I can just finish the point I was making and acknowledge what Lydia said there. So I think governments around the world have been working through the implications of this, and to pick up your point about sovereignty, it is not acceptable to the government of Australia or any other sovereign nation that giant global corporations are controlling the information that comes to our citizens. Traditional media is exposed to regulation in terms of content and other things, and we've been working to put in place similar regulation, including safety regulation.
But hang on, you've just cut off millions of your citizens to access.
Well, let's be very clear.
And regulation is different from a code that is supposed to regulate competition. Regulation, I think, of Facebook is a great idea. The thing I wanted to ask Lydia was, is she a supporter of the code or not, the code as it stands? I couldn't pick it up from what you were saying, Lydia.
Well, I've admitted that I don't have a lot of expertise on the actual code of itself, but I think with the media code, it's a sideshow, I think, to a bigger issue. The bigger issue is that these major companies have gained way too much power, and the media code is one very small part of dealing with that. There's more fundamental issues that we need to address here in terms of how we access information, who we let be the gatekeepers of that. Our access to information is a public good, and we have put it in the hands of commercial entities with very little regulation up until now. I think right now we're dealing with a reckoning around regulation and the actions of these companies. But there were many years before there where we were just caught up in the novelty of it all and didn't properly address these issues.
And can I just pick up on that point that Lydia has made, because it's a really powerful one. Going back 5 or 10 years ago, indeed when we were working on establishing the eSafety Commissioner, when the Australian government was talking about regulating the platforms, the message we got back was, oh no, you can't do that, you'll be a technological backwater. And that argument was widely accepted even 10 years ago. I think community attitudes have evolved quite sharply, and I think I'm very confident in saying what Facebook has done today will further cause an evolution of community attitudes.
The algorithms of big tech are designed to give viewers more of what they want to see. And this has made us more divided and polarised as a society. So what should be done to rectify this? And should it be the role of governments or the tech companies to devise the solution? Lydia
Khalil, the governments or the tech companies?
I think regulation lies in the hands of government. And I think that that question goes at the very heart of it. We have these non-transparent algorithms governing what we see and how we see it. These companies look at these algorithms as if it's commercial property, and they guard it as proprietary information, just like the spices for the KFC fried chicken. But the reality is these algorithms are actually governing a lot of our information and environment, and we don't have any transparency around them. So algorithmic transparency is really critical. It's difficult. It has to be done, smartly, but we have to do it. We can't have non-transparent algorithms ruling what it is, what information that we consume and how we connect online.
Hal Crawford, you were a news director in New Zealand when the Christchurch attacks happened. So much of those attacks were streamed live on some of the tech platforms like Facebook. But you, along with some of the other news bosses in New Zealand, then made some really big decisions, heavily criticised by some, about how you were going to cover this story.
Yeah, I was actually immensely proud of that little chapter, and of course it came in the wake of a horrific crime.
What did you decide?
Good point. We decided to cover the trial of the gunman in a certain way, and when I say we, I mean all of the news editors of New Zealand, all of the big newsrooms. So. I'd never been part of that before. I'd never been part of a very competitive environment where all the news editors get together and decide to do something that was basically decent.
Which was what?
Which was not give the guy publicity, basically, not sort of publicise his hateful ideology. And we were very successful. Where your competitor might delve into his ridiculous manifesto and get all sorts of juicy crap out of it, we decided that we wouldn't do that, and the guy just has faded into obscurity. He's a hateful individual, and he's not even smart. And with that collective ignoring, we had a bit of a victory.
Are you burying the news a bit?
Well, that's what we were accused of, and I thought, no, actually we're not. We're just doing the right thing.
Michelle?
I think whilst I agree there is a role for government and there is a role for industry, there is also a role for everyday citizens as well. I mean, you specifically ask about algorithms, Alice, and how that they are utilised by tech in order to deliver, get more eyeballs, get more clicks, etc. I'm a working mum with a 4-year-old and a 9-year-old that are smarter than I ever was at their age and have more access to technology. I struggle every day with this question, and I'm sure there are millions of Australian parents and citizens who feel the same way. Knowing how to get that balance between enabling our young people and as they grow to be able to access technology and access the internet and access all these applications. But you just look at YouTube, for example, there's an algorithm that determines what video will pop up next and what video will pop up after that. So I think that it is a role that needs to be played by all parties here, by industry, by government, and by citizens. We need to be empowered as citizens to make those decisions. We often get it wrong, we get judgment, but at the same time, I think that there is a role for everyone to play in this.
Julie, have tech companies forfeited the right to be trusted on this stuff? I mean, this is ultimately a question about whether they should be deciding the future of these platforms. But given what we've seen today, Facebook in Australia, can we trust them?
Yeah, it was more of a faceplant by Facebook, I think, today. It was a real misfire. But yeah, obfuscation is a huge problem. And I think that's one of the reasons that the minister wanted to put somebody in this role who had actually been in technology, so that I understand the dirty rules and the playbook. So I understand what the talking points are going to be.
What are the dirty rules?
Well, I'll give you an example of why I think we need to hold them to account. I had Facebook executives in the office last week, and they said, well, why do you keep criticizing us about moving Messenger to end-to-end encryption? I said, because I've been asking you for 18 months one question. What are you going to do to ensure that child sexual abuse material is not traded on that platform, and that when you flip that switch and it goes dark, you're not just going to go like this? Because they won't tell me what they are going to do to keep children safe. I give them suggestions. What about homomorphic encryption tools? What about behavioral signals? They won't commit to that. So they're trying to kick the can down the street so that they can flip the switch, and it happens, and they've been absolved of responsibility. And we've seen just in the 6 weeks that the e-privacy directive has eliminated companies' ability to scan for child sexual abuse images. Facebook said, we're stopping. NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in the United States, has seen a 50% decrease in the reporting of child sexual abuse images after just 6 weeks.
Lydia Khalil, you've been researching the rise of extremism within the United States and its connection to the tech platforms. Tell us what we don't know yet about this.
Well, I mean, no doubt the use of social media has increased the scope of radicalization because it has increased disinformation on these platforms. It's increased the ability of extremist actors to connect and to organize. It's also increased the widespread breadth of exposure to some of these extreme ideologies through these platforms. So social media has played a big role in terms of the growth of extremism. Now, the major tech companies like Facebook, YouTube, have done steps to address this. But like we've been talking about in the program, a lot of it has come too late. For example, we've seen with the QAnon phenomenon, that has taken off because of its activities on social media. And that conspiracy has led to real-world violence and harm. We saw it with the Capitol siege. They played a big part of that. Now, that was allowed to fester on major social media platforms for years before they decided to shut it down. So we've always seen this delayed reaction that the Commissioner was just speaking about, which has been problematic. The other side of this is what's going on outside of the major social media platforms. When they've been shut out, extremist actors have moved to smaller platforms that are even less regulated, and they go to platforms like Gab, Telegram, where they're able to go unfettered, and that's drawn in more extremist actors into those platforms. And so it's a real issue around technology and extremism and the growth of violent radicalization.
Right.
The thing is, though...
Can I just pick up on a couple of the themes from Lydia and Julie, and indeed Hal, that these companies have become very powerful very quickly. If you take the instance that Hal was talking about, if television stations, if anybody even suggested that they would broadcast murder occurring, that would have been unthinkable. And part of that is the responsibility and maturity of those businesses. But you take an action like today, shutting down services which are used to provide vital health information or other information. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about was I worked in the telco sector for a long time. Michelle has worked in the telco sector as well. There's a very strong culture in telco, in telecommunications, that you keep the network up, you connect people. That's your mission, that's your job. And for a company that is supposed to be providing communications, to just turn big parts of the network off today, as Facebook has done, and that would be, I think, unthinkable for telecommunications.
Can I take you up on a point there, Minister, around, I mean, if you're in telcos, you know that carriers are not the same as publishers, and carriers are not responsible for the material that they carry, otherwise they wouldn't work. And I think we've got a similar problem here. It's very simple to say, oh, they should have banned QAnon, they should ban everything. But effectively, they see themselves, and we use them as carriers. The utility to us would be much less if they were publishers. So it's not just about two big evil companies called Facebook and Google, it's about us. We demand social networks, and we demand search, and then we get the crap as well.
What message do you think the experience of Brittany Higgins, both the incident itself and how it was dealt with internally, sends to young Australian women who might be considering a career in politics? And do you think the new initiative proposed by the Prime Minister in response to the incident is enough to stamp out the well-known toxic workplace culture in our parliament?
Lydia Khalil?
I don't think it sends a very good message at all. But I think that this is an issue, like many issues that go beyond Parliament. I mean, on one hand, I'm incredibly grateful to Brittany for coming out and making these allegations publicly because it was clearly in the public interest. At the same time, I'm incredibly angry and incredibly frustrated that once again it falls to alleged victims to have to bear the brunt of it on their emotions and on their psyche to bring out these things into public light for us to do something about them. There is a serious problem in Australia, globally, around violence against women. And the fact that this alleged perpetrator felt that they would have such impunity to commit this act, whether they were impaired by alcohol or not, in the halls of power, in a minister's office, is just incredibly astounding to me. And it sends a terrible message. And clearly we have to do more, and men need to do more. This is a male problem.
Julie?
I mean, I think Brittany Higgins is extraordinarily brave, and I think about Grace Tame and that these two young, incredible women are bearing the brunt of some really important cultural change that needs to happen. And I go back to 30 years when I was working in the US Congress and had a similar incident happen. And I can understand why she would be paralyzed. And it's not about me. Thousands of Australian women have probably gone through this. It's global. And of course, I worked in high tech, which is male dominated. So all I want to say is we need to listen to these women. We need to believe them. We need to understand them. We need to help them. And we all have to get behind them and change the culture globally.
It will be news to many people watching that you experienced something similar. What made you at the time stand up and say something?
I didn't. I didn't for well over a year because it was my direct manager. I had to look at him every day, and I didn't. He had power, and I did not. I didn't feel I could confide in him. It wasn't until he left the office, and my congressman, we had just gone through the Anita Hill Clarence Thomas hearings, said, you know, Julie, I want you to write a sexual harassment policy. And by the way, this hasn't happened in our office, has it? And so I volunteered what happened, and guess what? There was a pattern of abuse and power. The woman who was in the role before me left because of this man. The woman at the reception was being sexually abused by this man. So again, it's about power. It's about precedent, and it's about being able to do it with impunity. So we have to act.
So what is it about these spaces? Because this is this question has come up time and time again on this program. So many stories emerge about what happens within our political spaces. What is it about the structure, the system, the imbalance that makes it so difficult for young women to be safe in their workplace?
Well, I mean, I remember our intern coordinator, who was a young man, used to hire the summer interns based on whether the guys were good baseball players or the girls were hot. You'd walk by, a Southern senator's office, and it would always have a pretty young woman in there. And the media in DC, this was 30 years ago, would turn their heads at any picadillo. So it is about male power structures, and it's hard to have a frame of reference if you're a grown adult man with power. to understand or be able to empathise with what a Brittany has experienced.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm really sorry that that happened to you. Paul Fletcher, does something need to change about the culture within the parties in order to facilitate a shift?
Well, I think we absolutely do need to learn from this. There's a number of processes that the Prime Minister has announced in response, including Celia Hammond, the member for Curtin, who's a former Vice-Chancellor of Notre Dame University, is leading a process. There's also some processes involving all of the party leaders. But yes, we do need to learn from this. And
you walk these halls. I mean, the exercising of power is brazen. You know, it's raw at times and it's very masculine. You know, the way it's done in Canberra, I walk around those halls just as you do, just as Michelle does. It's a very blokey environment, isn't it?
Yes.
Has that got to change?
Look, there are issues that we need to do a lot better on, of course. Nobody doubts it, nobody disputes.
Does that need to change, Michelle? I mean,
Absolutely.
It is so overtly blokey in Parliament.
Absolutely, and I think it has changed over the years, but it hasn't changed in some areas quickly enough. In terms of, for example, women's representation, that has improved in some aspects, but not in others. And Labor has made I can only speak for the Labor Party, we've made a very consistent attempt to do that over a couple of decades now in terms of affirmative action policies. But I think we also need to look beyond the representation there. We need to look at the advisor level, we need to look at inclusiveness as a whole. And that includes inclusiveness of First Nations people, ensuring that, you know, people with a disability are encouraged to be part of the parliamentary process in various roles. So it's always a matter of continuous improvement. I mean, Labor's got a policy going to our National Executive tomorrow to sign off on that's been thoroughly worked on within our caucus, going to all these points. But you can never stop trying. Like it is a constant, it requires constant vigilance. The job is never done.
How you used to work in one of the blokiest news environments in this country. Is it possible to shift the culture, change these dynamics?
Well, culture, it's a given that culture comes from the top. And actually, if you speak to CEOs, they really feel out of control most of the time, except for their cultural input. And that is, they set forms of behaviour and the norms that the organisation follows. And they do that by being who they are, but also explicitly. So I think, and I've had some parliamentary experience as well in state parliament, and I found it an intensely strange place. And I think that with all the ebbs and flows of power, you were talking about what it feels like. Well, it feels weird. And to me, you know, it's random people coming up and talking to you and you know, the exercise of power, but the handover of power. So the cultural continuity isn't there.
Look, it is clearly an unusual working environment. Michelle makes a good point about it's certainly politicians, but it's also people working in offices, and indeed everybody. There's over 4,000 people who work in Parliament House. They all have an entitlement to a safe workplace. It's about respect. It's about the behaviour that's modelled at all levels. And do we need to do better? Yes, we do.
OK. That's all we have time for tonight. A huge thanks to our panel, Paul Fletcher, Michelle Rowland, Hal Crawford, Julie Inman Grant and Lydia Khalil. Please thank all of them.